today with regards to amendments to the Lobbyist Act. And I'd like to preface my comments by saying that in broad terms, I support the notion of registration of lobbyists, and that I think it is important for transparency of government that we know who has registered themselves to talk to whom within the government. But I will also say that in my view, the increasing role that lobbyists play in our democracy is in some ways a testament to a failure. And that is the notion that individuals, or for that matter business entities or other entities, that they indeed need to engage the services of lobbyist firms in order to open doors, in order to exert influence on decision makers. And the fact that there is in fact a market, and in fact quite a lucrative market, for these organizations to exist, to me exemplifies that there has been a failure at some level within our system, whereby it is no longer possible for private individuals, for business entities, for nonprofit organizations, or for groups advocating a certain position on a certain issue, that they now need to have other parties act on their behalf. But that being said, the reality of it is that we have these entities that exist within our democracy, and that they do perform an important role. And I agree with the comments made by my honourable colleague, the member for Olds Didsbury Three Hills, in stating that the activities of lobbyists should not necessarily by default be viewed on as being in some ways bad or nefarious. The activities of lobbyists, in fact, are to provide sometimes a navigator, if you wish. Maybe I shouldn't use that term specifically, but to provide a person to help steer through the shoals of government, to open specific doors, to assist in getting face-to-face meetings with people that require the access to people who will make decisions. And so, from that standpoint, I think that the activities of lobbyists is, I don't even like to use the term necessary evil. I think it is a necessity within our current democracy. But if we're going to have that, I think it is important that there be certain parameters in place to make sure that we can have a level of confidence that the activities of these lobbyists are such that we're not seeing undue influence being exerted. And so, in that context, Madam Speaker, I'm a little disappointed in Bill 11. Because despite the good work that was done by the Resource Stewardship Committee, despite the long and laborious review process, in my view, there are still holes in this legislation. And I will certainly be proposing amendments during committee stage that will try to make this legislation a little bit more robust, make it a little bit stronger, but there are still holes within the legislation. Now, this government in the past has certainly prided itself on stating that it is advocating on behalf of open and transparent government, and that it wants its legislation to represent the gold standard of legislation in Canada. Well, this particular legislation, although it is an improvement over the existing Lobbyist Act, at very best wins a bronze, or maybe just an honourable mention, thank you for coming. It is a long way away from being the gold standard because, in fact, it falls short of many of the requirements within the Federal Lobbyist Act, which requires a much more stringent reporting on behalf of lobbyists, not just as to the start and the end date of their lobbying activities, but indeed they must report on when meetings are held, who these meetings were with, and what the broad-based subject matter, and though that information is accessible to the general public. The current registration, which basically just says who's lobbying, who they're going to lobby, or whom they're going to lobby, and what the broad subject matter is, like I say, it's a good start, but this legislation does not do anything to make that more robust. It includes some additional provisions which have already been outlined by previous speakers, but it does not really go to the extent of the federal legislation, which is certainly, in my view, more stringent, more strict, and a better representation of what we should be aiming for if we are indeed aiming for the level of transparency that this government ascribes to. One example where this legislation will fail, and it is an example that I'm particularly familiar with, Madam Speaker, is the example of lobbying that is done on behalf of tobacco firms. Now, this legislation does nothing to solve a problem that is ongoing, that this government used to rail against when they sat over here in this corner, and in about a year's time we'll be relegated back to this corner once again. This government railed against influence of big tobacco against the former government with regards to issues like higher tobacco taxes and specific tobacco reduction initiatives. Well, you know, it's sad, but the truth of the matter is that right now there are no less than 4 different firms and 10 different registered lobbyists representing big tobacco that have registered to meet with and to lobby various departments and divisions of this government, including the Office of the Premier, Minister of Health, the Executive Council, Alberta Health Services, the Ministry of Treasury, Board and Finance, the Ministry of Justice and Attorney General, the Solicitor General rather, and the Legislative Assembly as a whole. Now, people say, well, what's the problem? Well, the problem is those lobbying activities are in direct contravention to a framework that Alberta and Canada has been signatory to from the World Health Organization since 2004. The Framework Convention for Tobacco Control is an international convention, an international treaty that Canada signed on to in 2004. It was one of the first international treaties of this type, and Section 5.3 of that framework specifically enjoins government officials from having closed-door meetings with tobacco lobbyists. And yet we have 10 lobbyists, including, I might point out, one lobbyist who has very close ties to this government, who have filed the appropriate paperwork to allow them to lobby this government on issues including tobacco reduction, including tobacco taxation. And while most in the groups that are lobbying for a reduction of tobacco use, most of the people who are interested in preventive health care were encouraged by the early steps of this government, including adding menthol to the flavored tobacco legislation, which was a positive step, and increasing tobacco taxes in their first budget in October of 2015. Since that time, this government has done nothing to move the needle forward on tobacco reduction, on encouraging the reduction in tobacco use amongst our youth, and in fact are leaving unproclaimed large sections of pieces of legislation that would be very effective in reducing tobacco use, especially amongst vulnerable youth. And one has to ask the question, why? Why would all that momentum, why would all that hubris of the halcyon days, of the early days of this government, why has that ground to a halt? And one must only surmise that it is because of the backdoor, behind closed door activities of lobbying firms who are well-financed. Big Tobacco has lots of money, and they have lots of vested interest in making sure that the measures to reduce tobacco use amongst Albertans, the single most effective measure that could be taken to reduce overall death and disease in this province, to reduce the use of a product that causes the death of 3,800 Albertans every single year, that's more than 10 per day, that this government has done nothing to act on legislation that has already been passed to reduce tobacco usage. It's baffling, Madam Speaker, why that wouldn't happen. Not only would it reduce the pain and suffering associated with health, the negative effects on health by tobacco usage, But it's baffling that they wouldn't do it simply because, if for no other reason, if they are in fact interested in bending the health cost curve, which I've yet to be convinced of, but if they are in fact interested in that objective, then why are they not going after the low-hanging fruit that is represented by a reduction in tobacco usage? And one can only surmise that the reason they are is that because Big Tobacco has been actively lobbying this government behind closed doors in direct contravention of the framework on tobacco control, and has been influencing the government in that way. And the Bill 11 does absolutely nothing to stop that. Absolutely nothing. So if this government is really interested in fixing the problems, if this government is truly interested in taking a look at what is deficient in current legislation and actually addressing it in an effective way, surely one of the things that should be included in this legislation is a clause, is a section that specifically enjoins government from participating with lobbyists in contravention to a signed international convention or treaty. And I looked through Bill 11 for that specific clause, and it isn't there. And so from that standpoint, and from the standpoint that Bill 11 lacks a reference that would make it as robust as federal legislation that's already on the books, that requires lobbyists to log individual meetings with individual members, whether they are MLAs or senior members of the bureaucracy. That's not required in this piece of legislation. That is required under the federal legislation, but not here. But more specifically, because of the failure of this legislation to address an activity that is not some theoretical activity, that isn't something that might happen, that in fact is happening, that this government refuses to take on the issue of dealing with powerful lobbies. And, you know, one would have to ask the question. We're involved right now in a $10 billion lawsuit with Big Tobacco, trying to sue Big Tobacco, as are all 9 other Canadian provinces, for health care costs that are a direct result of tobacco usage by our citizens. You know, one would have to ask, you know, why, if we're involved in a legal case, why is Big Tobacco got 4 different firms and 10 different lobbyists registered to lobby the people we're suing? You know, that's one of those questions that I don't think has an answer, but it's certainly baffling as to why that would go on. In addition, Madam Speaker, one would have to ask the question why this government has been so inactive, so disappointingly inactive after its initial promising phases to actually do something positive about tobacco reduction. And it's not like they had to come up with new legislation of their own. All they needed to do was proclaim the existing legislation that has already been passed and already on the books, and yet they refuse to do it. In addition, Madam Speaker, this government is not acting on legislation that has an expiry date. Some of these pieces of legislation, if they're not proclaimed within the next year, that piece of legislation will in fact expire. And once again, one asks, well, why are they waiting? These pieces of legislation were passed in most cases with all parties' support within this place, from support of all parties, because it was widely recognized the benefits of having measures to reduce tobacco use. For some reason, influences on this government have stepped forward and stopped this government from its forward progress. And now that we're dealing with cannabis, of course, you know, it seems that tobacco has taken a back burner position because of the urgency of bringing in cannabis legislation. No, Madam Speaker, I'm concerned that there are deficiencies in Bill 11. I will be raising amendments that I hope will be supported by the government side in order to address those deficiencies. But in its current form, Bill 11 certainly has got significant problems, and though it's well-intentioned, it does not meet the needs of Albertans.